So, in keeping with Reverend Tim McFarland's theme of things I've learned from books, I guess the book that I've chosen to talk about today is George Orwell's 1984. And it may surprise some of you to know that actually growing up, I read precious few books. In my house, it's not that we didn't read, but it would mostly have been newspapers and magazines. My parents really didn't have any time for fiction. And I have to say that in school, I was much more likely to read Cole's notes than the actual book. Until, of course, the day that I graduated from high school, when I was no longer required to read the books. And so one of the first books that I read was 1984. So as some of you may remember, 1984 was written in 1948 and was about a dystopian society in 1984, so the future at the time. And it follows the trials and tribulations of Winston Smith, a middle-class worker in Airstrip 1, which was the ruins of former England. So at that time, the world was divided into three superstates: Oceania, comprised of the Americas, Great Britain, Southern Africa, and Australia; Eurasia, comprised of Russia and continental Europe; and East Asia, comprised of China, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. And what's notable about this dystopian world is that the three superstates are in a state of perpetual but unwinnable war with each other. And they're in war in the disputed zone, which comprised of North and Central Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. And it's interesting that in 1984, the purpose of war is not to win new territories or to gain access to resources. The purpose of war is to consume human labor and commodities. This is so that the state can use up a majority of the food and manufactured products, which allows the state to keep the people poor, but yet united, so that they will never rise up and rebel against the government. And it's also interesting that during the time that I have been alive, I can recall no time at which we have either not been at war or under threat of war. So the major ones that I can remember would have been the Vietnam War, the Cold War, two wars in Iraq, the war against Al-Qaeda and Afghanistan, and currently ISIL, which just happened to be, most of them happen to lie in this disputed zone. The main principles or philosophies by which the states exercise their power over the people are doublethink, newspeak, and continuous surveillance of the populace. Doublethink is the act of simultaneously believing two contradictory ideas. The three most famous ones in 1984 are the slogans inscribed in massive letters on the Ministry of Truth. And they are "War is peace," which we later come to know as war, or having a common enemy keeps the people united. Freedom is slavery. Independent people will be persecuted by the state. Ignorance is strength. Ignorance cements the power of the party. Just a couple of ones that we might find in society today: peace through strength, which is usually a justification for military buildup. And perhaps most sadly, one that we've recently come to hear over the past few weeks, that refugees are terrorists. and therefore allows us to justify not helping them and bringing them to Canada. The second part of 1984, I guess, Newspeak, is the ability of the state to exert thought control through control over language and vocabulary. So, Mini Plenty is the short or abbreviated form of the Ministry of Plenty, whose actual role is to ration or restrict food and goods to the people. Mini True, the Ministry of Truth, is actually the propaganda arm of government and is responsible for correcting historical records. In fact, I can recall during the first war in Iraq that Saddam Hussein was once a great friend and ally. But of course, that was when he was fighting the Ayatollahs in Iran. And seemingly overnight, he became a terrible monster that we had to remove from power. Conveniently forgotten is that he actually committed his worst atrocities when he was our ally. Mini Love, the Ministry of Love, was responsible for torture and punishment and re-education. And Mini Pax, the Ministry of Peace, which was responsible for war. It's interesting to note that the original names of the Department of Defense in the US was actually the Department of War. And even in Canada, our Department of National Defense was previously known as the Department of National War Services. A few examples of Newspeak in today's society: downsizing, which is really just firing employees. Now, there was a time when companies fired or laid off employees because they weren't making money. But today, I find it interesting that companies frequently downsize because they haven't made enough money. The Fair Elections Act, which might also be known as the Voter Suppression Act, which interestingly prohibits Elections Canada from encouraging Canadians to vote. So I hope you all vote in tomorrow's election, if you haven't already done so. And perhaps the most creative of all, the USA Patriot Act, which is a backronism, so I guess an invented acronym to make it sound more appealing, and stands for Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act. In other words, continuous surveillance. So, the third pillar of the government's reach or power in 1984 is continuous surveillance of all aspects of citizens' lives by the states. And in 1984, this is euphemised by the slogan, "Big Brother is watching you." Now, even when I read 1984 in the late 80s, and I knew that many aspects, even then, were automatically recorded. So anytime you used a credit card, your transactions are automatically recorded by the credit card company. Even then, anytime you made a telephone call, the outgoing and incoming numbers and the durations were all automatically recorded. But at that time, at least the state required judicial oversight in order to retrieve the data or information. What's interesting is that thanks to Edward Snowden, we realize that the government is watching us all the time. So Edward Snowden revealed that the United States NSA, in cooperation with the partners, the Five Eyes, which includes Canada, has set up a global surveillance network that monitors all electronic communications without any oversight, or very little oversight whatsoever. In fact, he once noted that while working for the NSA, that just by sitting at his desk, he had the power to wiretap anyone, anywhere in the world, without any oversight, judicial oversight, just by having access to somebody's email address. Now, I find it interesting when I read 1984, at the time, I had thought that that level of surveillance would never be possible. And what I find is scary is that it's actually so much worse than I had ever imagined. One of the features of 1984 were telescreens, or TVs, that could never be turned off. And they were used for surveillance because they had built-in cameras and microphones, and so the government could have access to them, and therefore watch and hear what people were doing. And I find it very interesting that if you've ever bought a smart TV, it has a camera and a microphone. If you have a computer, it has a camera and a microphone. If you have a tablet, it has a camera and a microphone. And of course, if you have one of these, it is so advanced and powerful that it has two cameras. And even though we, in theory, can turn them off, somehow we just never seem to be able to turn them off. At least me. I know I had resisted a cell phone for a long time, until, of course, they came out with the smartphone. And it was just so seductive and alluring. It could do so many things. And I got a very nice beep or buzz every time something interesting came to my phone. So, as I said, in many ways, I think it's so much worse than I had ever imagined. And if you think that you could escape it by going to church, one of the latest trends is worship surveillance, where an all-seeing eye of not God, but a video camera glares down on parishioners worshiping from above. So, in summary, I'd like to conclude by saying, I used to think that 1984 was a commentary on communism, but perhaps it is really just a reflection of our own society.